The first time the pines ever spoke to me, I wasn't young enough to be reckless, but I was still too young to believe in anything I couldn't explain. I remember the wind pushing through those tall silhouettes, bending them like ribs around the spine of the mountain, and thinking the sound was just weather, just pressure, just the forest doing what forests do. But the voice threaded through it was shaped, purposeful, almost patient. And in that moment, with the dusk bleeding out behind the ridge and the light dying faster than it should have, I felt something I had never felt before in my years of working these woods, the sense that I was no longer the one watching. I was being watched. My name is not important. I'm in my 40s now, old enough to know that pride is nothing more than a hollow log, looks sturdy from the outside, but knock once and the truth of the rot rings through. I've worked in the northern ranges of Washington for nearly 2 decades, patrolling a patch of wilderness the locals call the Borrowed Pines. They call it that because, according to some of the elders, the forest doesn't belong to us. It belongs to whatever lived here first, not animals, not spirits in any romantic sense. Something older, something that had never been given a name accurate enough to satisfy those who encountered it. Most folks brush that off as stories, but I've learned, slowly, painfully, that stories told in low voices by people who avoid eye contact aren't entertainment. They're warnings. I wasn't always like this. I used to walk the tree lines with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, believing I had seen everything the mountains could throw at me. I'd handled lost hikers, injured rock climbers, sudden storms, fallen trees, even an angry black bear that decided my truck bumper looked at him wrong. Fear was a tool, sharp, necessary, but always in my hands. But fear doesn't stay yours forever out here. It was early autumn the first time something in these woods challenged that confidence. The air was brittle with cold in the mornings, but warm just enough at midday to make the ground sweat. Mist clung low in the valleys, forming these pale rivers that flowed soundlessly between stands of cedar. My radio crackled with the usual chatter, trail updates, weather advisories, a mundane missing dog report. Nothing unusual, nothing that hinted at what was coming. I'd been assigned a routine perimeter check along the northern boundary, about 18 miles of dense pine stretching toward the higher ridgelines. Quiet area. Almost too quiet. You could hike 3 days up there and never hear another person, which I usually liked. Solitude clears the mind, allows you to hear your own thoughts, though I would later wish for the opposite. Some thoughts are better drowned out. Around the 10th mile, I started noticing the silence. Rangers notice things like that. You spend long enough outdoors and your brain develops a kind of catalog of background sounds. Wind patterns, bird calls, branches shifting, distant water. When something's missing, it's like walking into your own home and realizing a piece of furniture has been moved. Subtle, but wrong. And the silence that day, it wasn't absence. It felt intentional. I kept moving, slowing my pace, letting my ears guide me. Nothing. No birds, no squirrels, no insects, just the sound of my own boots sinking into the softened earth. Then from ahead, maybe 40 yards, I heard 3 knocks. Not natural sounds, not falling branches, not woodpeckers. These were deliberate, slow, each one spaced with unsettling patience. Knock. A pause long enough to make me hold my breath. Knock. A second pause, longer still, as though whatever made the sound wanted me to anticipate the last. Knock. I froze. My first instinct was to radio dispatch, but instinct wasn't exactly cooperating. The knocks seemed to vibrate through the soil into my legs, making it feel like the forest was trying to communicate through bone. I forced myself to breathe, to think, to ground myself in something rational. Sounds carry strangely in valleys. Someone could be chopping wood farther away than it seemed. That was a reasonable explanation, a safe explanation. But I knew better. No one lived up there, and no campsites had been registered for that section in over a month. Besides, that rhythm, 3 slow knocks, matched something I'd heard only once before. Not in person, in a story. One of the old-timers in town, a logger named Whit, used to come into the station from time to time for for coffee when the temperature dropped below freezing. He had that kind of leathery skin you only get from decades spent working under the glare of sun on snow, and a voice like gravel in a bucket. He told me early on that the Borrowed Pines had their own knocks, that if you ever heard 3 of them, each one slower than the last, you needed to leave the area immediately, because it wasn't a warning, it was a test. He said the knocks let the forest know where you were. I didn't believe him, not really. But that day, hearing them for the first time myself, I remembered every word he'd said, and the memory crawled coldly through my chest. I stepped forward cautiously. Something in me, curiosity, duty, stubbornness, pushed me to move toward the sound instead of away from it. I kept one hand near the flare on my belt, the other near the bear spray. As I reached the small clearing ahead, the air shifted. It felt thicker, like walking into a pocket of warm breath in an otherwise cold room. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. No movement. But the smell hit me, faint, metallic, almost like wet iron. Blood, my brain whispered before I could stop it. Not fresh, not strong, more like the memory of blood, a scent that shouldn't have been drifting on the wind without a source. Then something moved, not in the trees, not ahead. To my left, just past the rim of the clearing. A shape, broad-shouldered, too tall to be a person. The height was all wrong. The mass of it was wrong. It shifted between the trunks like a shadow that had learned how to stand upright. I didn't see features, only outline, a quiet, deliberate displacement of the world behind it. And then the sound came, not knocks this time, but breathing, slow, heavy, like it was inhaling the scent of me. My throat tightened. Something primal slid beneath my ribs, a warning written in instinct older than language. I stepped back once, twice, the forest floor groaning under my boots. The breathing grew louder. My radio crackled sharply, the sudden noise cleaving the moment in half. Unit 3, check in. You're overdue. I swallowed hard, forced breath into my lungs. Unit 3, I said, voice trained. I'm here, just checking something out. What's your 20? I hesitated, eyes locked on the place where the shape had been. The space was empty now. Quiet again. Wrong again. Before I could answer, the radio hissed with static, deep, granular static, like something brushing against the microphone, but the voice that cut through it wasn't dispatch. It was a whisper. Close. Too close. Leave. The words slithered through the frequency with a cold clarity that shattered through every rational thought I had. My hand shook as I lowered the radio. The static stopped. The forest went still. I didn't run. Not yet. But something inside me cracked open. A tiny fracture in the certainty I once carried so easily. I backed away slowly, not turning my back until the trees grew thicker and the clearing vanished from sight. Only when I could no longer feel that breathing, that presence, that attention upon me, did I finally turn and make my way down the trail, pulse hammering, every shadow suddenly alive with possibility. I didn't tell dispatch what had really happened. Not then. Not ever. Because how do you confess that the forest you've devoted your life to protecting may be studying you too? And that was only the beginning. For the rest of that day, every sound in the forest carried a new weight. Even the ordinary noises, wind pushing through the canopy, branches shifting, the muted flutter of wings, seemed sharpened, as if the woods were testing how I reacted to each one. When I reached the ranger station, I tried to slip back into routine, but routine felt like clothing that no longer fit. I checked gear, logged mileage, signed off my route, smiled at a coworker who asked how the patrol had gone. Every response felt delayed, like my mind was taking a full second longer to return from the trees. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, listening to the low hum of insects in the dark. The Borrowed Pines rose behind my cabin, tall and unmoving, their silhouettes swallowing the stars along the ridge. And though logically I knew the thing I'd encountered was miles away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that forest was still listening, still aware of me. Maybe that should have been the point where I filed a report, took a few days off, or asked for reassignment. But rangers aren't built like that. We don't quit because the woods push back. And I had always trusted my own reasoning. If I couldn't explain something, it was because I hadn't looked hard enough. So I convinced myself it had been a trick of light, or exhaustion, or overactive nerves from the sudden silence. My brain grabbed for anything that made sense. But the next encounter didn't care about sense. It was a week later, during a search and rescue call. A hiker hadn't returned from a one-day trip up into the narrow granite ravines along the eastern ridge. The terrain there is unforgiving. Thin trails, sharp drop-offs, roots that twist just beneath the surface. A misstep can turn fatal fast. I've responded to enough calls like that to know time becomes its own enemy. We set out early. The clouds hung low and gray, pressing the humidity into our shirts. 2 deputies accompanied me. We moved together, spaced about 10 feet apart, calling the missing woman's name as we climbed. About 4 miles in, the atmosphere shifted again. Not silence this time, but its opposite. Noise filled the air, birds calling in frantic bursts, branches cracking in unnatural rhythms, wind rising and falling in abrupt waves. Chaos, as though the forest couldn't decide which sound belonged. I don't know if the deputies noticed, but I did. I could feel the dissonance vibrating in my teeth. By the time we reached the ravine, sweat was clinging cold against my back. The deputies split off to search the right side of the canyon while I followed a narrow goat path leading left. The rocks were slick, the air heavier. Everything felt closer than it should have been. I found her backpack first, wedged between 2 boulders, straps torn, pockets unzipped. A few items were strewn nearby. A water bottle, a torn piece of map, a single hiking pole snapped in half. But no tracks, no drag marks. Nothing suggesting she had fallen or wandered off. Just sudden absence. I radioed the others, told them to converge on my location. They were still 15 minutes out when I found the cave. Calling it a cave feels generous. It was more like a wound, a narrow slit in the rock, half hidden behind a fallen tree, dark enough that even the light seemed reluctant to go near it. The opening was only about 4 feet wide, tall enough to crouch into, and the smell drifting from inside was the same metallic scent from the clearing, the same iron-sweet heaviness. I crouched near the entrance, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam disappeared almost immediately, swallowed by the black like the cave refused to reflect it. The air inside was warm, far too warm for a naturally ventilated formation. It felt like standing near an exhale. I called the woman's name. My voice didn't echo. It simply died. That was the moment the doubt started. Not fear. Doubt. Doubt in reality as I understood it. Doubt in what caves were supposed to be. Doubt in my own role. Because as I stared into that darkness, a thought I couldn't explain slid into my mind. It's not a cave. I pulled back instinctively, shaking the thought off like a spider's web. The deputies arrived, huffing from the climb. One of them spotted the backpack and started taking photos. The other walked up beside me, shining his own light into the opening. "Hell of a spot," he muttered. "Think she went in there?" "I don't know," I said, though the truth was crawling beneath my skin. "Maybe." He crouched lower. "Should we check it?" The beam from his flashlight flickered. Once, twice, then went out entirely. He smacked the base. "Battery's dead." "No," I said before I could think. "Don't go in." He looked up at me, eyebrows raised. "Why not?" I didn't have an answer that wouldn't make me sound insane, so I forced my voice to stay steady. Bad air pocket, might be unstable. It was a lie, a small one, but necessary. Something in me, something instinctual, knew the cave wasn't meant to be entered. Not by us, not during a search, not at all. The deputies exchanged looks. They trusted me. I'd led search teams for years. I'd been the level head in storms and the calm voice when cliffs gave way. If I said a cave was unsafe, they believed it. We marked the location and continued searching outward in widening circles, calling the woman's name until our voices grew hoarse. We never found her. The official report listed the disappearance as presumed lost due to environmental conditions. But I knew the truth. The environment didn't take her. That cave did, or whatever the cave really was. And it hadn't just taken her, it had presented itself to me like it wanted me to see it. For days afterward, I replayed that moment in my mind. The warmth of the air, the way my flashlight vanished, the thought that wasn't mine, the memory of the shape earlier that week. Somehow it all felt connected, strands of the same web tightening around me. I stopped sleeping through the night. Every knock on my cabin's walls, normal settling sounds I'd heard for years, made my back tense. Every shift in the wind made me glance toward the tree line. And every time the radio crackled, I expected to hear that whisper again. But the forest wasn't finished with me yet. The next story isn't one I've told many people. It happened months later in winter when the snow lay thick enough to mute everything into a soft, suffocating quiet. Most animals were scarce. Trails were closed. Visitors stayed away. It was the kind of season where a ranger could go days without seeing another soul. I'd been sent to check an abandoned firewatch cabin built in the 1960s. Old place. Rumors said the last ranger assigned to it had quit after only one season, claiming the nights were too loud even though he worked alone. No one bothered reopening it after that. When I reached the cabin, snow covered the roof in a heavy white blanket. The windows were frosted opaque. The wind formed small spirals on the porch steps, each twisting in the same clockwise direction, as though shaped by a deliberate hand. I pushed the door open. It groaned like something waking from long sleep. The interior smelled of dust and cold wood, untouched for years. I swept my flashlight along the walls, checking for structural damage, rodent activity, mold, nothing unusual. Then, behind me, the door clicked shut. I turned sharply, light slicing across the room. No wind, no shifting frame, no reason for the door to move. But on the window, the frost had changed. Instead of the natural branching pattern, a single shape had appeared. A handprint, large, too large, and it wasn't on the inside. It was pressed from the outside. I stood there, breath shallow as a familiar warmth pushed against the cold air. The same warmth from the cave, the same metallic scent curling faintly into my lungs. A feeling spread through the cabin, thick and deliberate. I wasn't alone, and whatever had been watching me since autumn was no longer content with distance. The handprint remained on the frosted window, unmoving, its outline sharp despite the windless stillness surrounding the cabin. I walked toward it slowly, each step weighted with an instinct that screamed against my mind's reasoning. The shape wasn't distorted like a human handprint might be if pressed against ice. It wasn't smudged or softened by the cold. It was exact. Every indentation where a ridge should be was too clear, too precise, as if the print had been carved into the frost instead of impressed from outside. I reached out, touching the inside of the glass with my fingertips. The cold bit immediately, numbing my skin. But the print itself felt strangely warm through the pane, as if a heat source pressed against the opposite side. I stepped back. The warmth behind the glass was impossible, and yet I felt it. A deep, subtle breath, like the exhale of something enormous. The wind outside shifted, stirring the snow across the porch. The boards creaked softly. Then, unmistakably, I heard the crunch of weight on fresh snow. One step, then another, moving along the wall toward the front of the cabin. Something was circling. A rational part of my mind tried desperately to categorize it as a bear, or maybe a moose displaced by early winter scarcity. But the spacing of the footsteps, too slow, too deliberate, didn't match any wildlife I'd ever tracked. I'd spent my entire life reading footprints in the snow. I knew the cadence of every creature that lived in these woods. This gate didn't belong to any of them. I backed toward the center of the cabin, flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. The beam jittered across the ceiling, catching old cobwebs and dust particles. The air felt charged, humming faintly, as though the space was filling with static electricity. The footsteps stopped. Silence settled so thick that I could hear my own pulse thudding in my ears. Then, knock. A single slow strike against the wooden wall. I froze. The knock wasn't on the door. It came from the rear of the cabin, right behind the old stove, a place where the snow outside lay undisturbed, a place where nothing should have been standing. Another knock sounded, this time higher up, closer to the window. Then a breath, deep and low, sliding along the seam where the wall met the roof. I raised the flashlight toward the ceiling, hoping to see nothing. The rafters were empty. The sound wasn't coming from the ceiling. It was inside the wall. A cold realization gripped my spine. The cabin was too old, too thin, too poorly insulated to hide anything within its walls. There were no crawl spaces, no storage cavities, no construction gaps large enough for anything with weight to move through. But something was moving. The breath deepened, drawing in a slow inhale as though smelling through the wood. The handprint on the window grew more defined, as if whatever had left it pressed harder against the outside or leaned closer. And then a voice, quiet, broken, almost choked by the thickness of the air, whispered from behind the wall, not through the radio, not an echo from the cave, not memory or fear, a real voice. Ranger. The sound slithered down my spine like ice. It wasn't the word that terrified me, it was the tone. It didn't sound human. It sounded like someone trying to mimic human speech, trying to shape air with a mouth not meant for it. I stumbled back, knocking into a table. A tin cup clattered to the floor, rolling across the boards until it spun itself still. The voice inside the wall shifted, seemed to lean toward the sound. A scraping began, slow, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging along the interior wood paneling. The scrape moved horizontally, passing behind the stove, then climbing upward toward the loft ladder. I backed farther away, eye locked on the ceiling now, unsure where it would emerge, if it would emerge. The scraping stopped at the loft opening. My flashlight followed the sound, but the darkness above absorbed the beam. It was like shining a light into a mouth. Then the boards beneath my feet vibrated. Something heavy landed on the roof. Snow slid in a long sheet off one side, thudding loudly onto the ground. The impact shook dust from the rafters. I held my breath as a second impact landed, closer to the chimney this time. Then a third, right above the door. It was moving overhead, testing the structure, testing me. The walls groaned under the shifting weight. The handprint on the window began to fade, not from cold, not from time, but as though the heat behind it was moving away. Retreating. Then everything went silent. No wind, no scraping, no breathing, no footsteps, just blank, heavy stillness. And then the door handle turned, not violently, not in a rush, slowly. A careful rotation of old metal, as if whatever stood on the other side wanted me to hear it. My body locked. Fight or flight froze into something worse. Indecision. My mind screamed to block the door, to hide, to run, to do anything. But another part of me, something small and terrified, believed movement would only draw more attention. The handle clicked fully downward. I waited for it to swing open, but it didn't. Instead, the handle released, returning to its upright position with a soft metallic snap. I swallowed hard, pulse hammering in my neck. A sound rose outside then, faint, deep, resonant, like a low-frequency call echoing through the trees. It wasn't a howl. It wasn't an animal vocalization. It sounded almost like a humming, a long, steady vibration that pressed against the cabin walls like a tidal current. I stepped backward until I hit the far wall, my breath shallow. The hum grew louder. Then it stopped. For several long seconds, nothing moved. Finally, the wind returned, brushing snow from the trees, sighing through the cracks in the old cabin walls. The atmosphere lightened ever so slightly, enough for my lungs to stop tightening. I didn't stay the night, not in that place. I radioed in a fabricated report. Structural instability, risk of collapse, returning early. I didn't care how it sounded. I needed to be away from those walls. I walked out into the snow, keeping my flashlight angled toward the surrounding trees. The forest stood still, silent, the branches sagging under the weight of ice. But when I reached the porch steps, I saw something that made my breath fog in a sharp gasp. Tracks. Huge tracks. Not the shape of boots. Not hooves. Not paws. The impressions were elongated, wide, each print sunk deeply into the snow, like something with considerable mass had stepped onto it. Something walking upright. The stride length was nearly 5 feet. They circled the cabin completely, looping twice near the back wall, Then crossing the porch where the snow had been disturbed by the earlier fall, the tracks continued into the tree line, vanishing where the canopy thickened. I crouched near one of the prints and brushed away a layer of snow with gloved fingers. The edges were warm, not melted, warm, as if the creature that left them radiated heat powerful enough to resist the cold long after it had passed. A tremor ran through my chest. This wasn't a story. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't exhaustion or nerves. Something had come to the cabin. Something had circled it. Something had tried the door. And as I stared deeper into the pines, I realized something else with a clarity that shook me. It wasn't the first time it had watched me. It had followed me from autumn, from the clearing, from the cave. And now it wanted more than distance. It wanted recognition. It wanted presence. It wanted me to understand that these woods, its woods, no longer allowed me the illusion of ignorance. I stood there in the winter dark, snow drifting over the fresh tracks, listening to the quiet pulse of the forest. The borrowed pines had taken notice of me, and whatever lived within them was getting closer. I followed those enormous tracks into the dark without fully deciding to. My boots moved on their own, crunching through the snow in a slow, steady rhythm that betrayed none of the shaking in my hands. Every rational part of me screamed to turn back, return to the truck, call the station, pretend the world still made sense. But there was an older instinct, buried deep, that pulled me forward. Something between dread and duty, like stepping toward the edge of a cliff just to confirm the drop is real. The tracks weaved between the thick pines, each print still radiating a faint warmth. The deeper I followed them, the more the forest changed. The wind died. The temperature rose. The air felt thicker as if I were descending, though the terrain stayed level. Snow clung to the branches in heavy mounds but refused to fall, frozen in unnatural stillness. About 50 yards from the cabin, the tracks stopped abruptly. No gradual fading, no sign of turning, just an end, like whatever made them had simply vanished mid-step. I crouched beside the last print, brushing away the light dusting of snow. The warmth was stronger here, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. The air smelled faintly of pine sap, iron, and something else, something sour like wet stone left too long in darkness. Then I noticed the trees. Every trunk within a 10-foot radius held scratches. Deep, vertical gouges carved into the bark with a precision that made my stomach knot. The marks weren't random. They formed narrow columns, each separated by the exact same distance. I'd seen trees marked before, bears marking territory, elk rubbing velvet, even human vandalism, but this was different. These were symbols, not letters, not runes, but something that conveyed intent, meaning, a boundary, or a message. My breath fogged thinly at first, then stopped fogging entirely, the air warming too much for condensation. I wiped a sleeve across my mouth, unsure if I was imagining it. Then, deeper in the trees, something exhaled. Not a gust of wind, not a shifting animal, a single steady breath. I stood slowly, flashlight angled low, letting the edges of the beam play across the snow and branches. For a moment, nothing moved, but the sense of being watched clung to me like damp fabric. I took one step backward. The trees exhaled again. A shape detached itself from the shadows, barely visible, not fully formed, just a shifting distortion between the trunks. Too tall, too broad. Its outline rippled like heat rising off asphalt, its edges trembling with each breath of the forest. I held my ground because I didn't know what else to do. Running didn't feel like an option. Neither did staying. I was caught in that terrible middle ground, suspended between survival instincts that contradicted each other. The shape tilted. Not its head, though that's what my mind insisted on calling it, but the entire mass, as if it were adjusting itself to fit a space meant for something smaller. My voice cracked out of me before I realized I was speaking. "What do you want?" The shape swayed slightly, as if absorbing the sound. The woods dimmed around it, the snow reflecting less light, the air compressing. For a moment, I thought it would answer. Not with words, nothing that unnatural could form language as I understood it, but with something. Instead, it stepped backward, into the trees, into the dark, and vanished. The forest snapped back into movement. Snow slid from branches. Wind whispered through the needles. My breath fogged again. The warmth dissipated, replaced by the honest cold of winter. It was gone. But the tracks behind me, the ones leading from the cabin, told a different story. It hadn't approached randomly. It had followed, it had circled, it had watched, and now it had revealed itself fully enough that I understood at least one truth. The borrowed pines were no longer letting me exist as an observer. I had become a participant. I returned to the cabin, fingers numb, mind buzzing with a kind of fear I didn't have words for. I didn't go inside. I didn't need another moment trapped in those walls. Instead, I radioed the station with a terse report. Cabin compromised, heading back. No one questioned it. Winter reports were often short, to the point, but if anyone had heard the tremor beneath my voice, they didn't mention it. The drive down the mountain was slow. Snow drifted across the road, forming small ripples like frozen waves. Every time my headlights caught movement between the pines, my grip tightened around the steering wheel. Most of it was just wind or branches settling, but some shapes stood too still. Some silhouettes lingered too long. Twice, I pulled the truck over, stepping out into the night air to scan the woods in every direction. No tracks, no warmth, no breathing, but always that feeling, being watched. By the time I reached the ranger station, dawn had begun dissolving the horizon. A thin gray-blue band stretched across the sky. The building's lights glowed faintly through the frost-covered windows. I sat in the truck for several minutes before forcing myself to step out. Inside, the familiar scent of old coffee and pine disinfectant settled around me like a blanket I didn't feel I deserved anymore. My coworker Mattson was already there. Older ranger, kind eyes, steady demeanor. The kind of man who could gut a fish, joke about tax forms, and quote tree species like scripture. He glanced up when he saw me. "You look like you slept in a ditch." "Didn't sleep," I answered simply. He took a slow sip of his coffee, watching me. "You want to talk about it?" I almost did. I almost spilled everything. The handprint, the scraping, the breathing, the towering shape that pulled itself out of the dark and watched me without eyes. But the words stuck. They always stuck. Finally, I said, "Have you ever seen something out there you couldn't explain?" Mattson's expression shifted. Subtle. "But I saw it. Out there, everyone has a story." "No," I said. "I mean something that follows you." He set his coffee cup down slowly, very deliberately. "Something followed you last night?" "Something's been following me," I whispered. A long silence passed. For the first time since meeting him, Mattson seemed unsure of what to say. His eyes drifted toward the window, toward the pines. Then he spoke. "What did you hear? Not what did you see? Not what happened. What did you hear?" As though that was the only question that mattered. The weight of the past months settled on my shoulders, the knocks in the clearing, the voice on the radio, the breath behind the cabin wall, the humming outside, the exhale in the forest. I told him the truth. I heard something breathing, too close, too heavy, like it knew me. Mattson didn't react the way I expected. No skepticism, no laughter, no concern for my mental state. Instead, he nodded, once, slowly. "There are things in these forests," he said quietly, "that don't need to be seen to know who you are." A chill ran through me. "You've encountered it?" "Not the same one," he said, "but something old, something that marks people." "Marks?" His gaze locked onto mine. "When the forest chooses someone, it doesn't stop." The room seemed to shrink around us. Then he said one more thing, something that hit with the force of a falling tree. "You should have never gone near that cave." My blood ran cold. "I never told you about the cave." His jaw tightened. "You didn't have to." Before I could ask what he meant, his eyes shifted toward the window again. The pines outside were perfectly still, perfectly silent, perfectly attentive. Mattson didn't elaborate. He simply stood there with his coffee halfway to his lips, staring out the window as if the trees themselves had spoken, and he was waiting to hear the rest. His stillness unnerved me more than the handprint on the cabin window, more than the footsteps circling the walls, more than the shape that breathed in the dark. He wasn't confused. He wasn't skeptical. He was afraid. And that, more than anything, told me I wasn't losing my mind. "What do you mean the forest chooses someone?" I finally asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the bulletin board at the back of the station, a cluttered patchwork of maps, reports, old flyers, and yellowing newspaper clippings. He sifted through a few layers of paper until he found a thin, folded pamphlet. The edges were brittle. The ink had faded to a dull gray-green. He handed it to me without a word. I opened it. The front page showed an old black-and-white photograph of 3 rangers standing beside the 1960s fire cabin, the same one I had been in the night before. But the photo wasn't what caught me. It was the date, 1967, and the note scrawled in the margin. "Returned alone. Said it followed him through the walls. Couldn't stay." A second line was scratched beneath it in a darker, shakier hand. "Not hallucinations. Not wind. Not an animal." I swallowed hard. "Who wrote this?" "The last ranger assigned to that cabin," Matson said. "He quit after winter, never spoke publicly about it, but he left that note with the station manager at the time. My grandfather." I stared at him. "Your grandfather?" Matson nodded slowly. "Some things run in families. Fear is one of them. So is knowledge." I didn't like the way he said that, as if knowing made you vulnerable, as if understanding pulled you deeper into whatever watched these woods. Matson pulled a chair out from the table and lowered himself into it, motioning for me to do the same. When I sat across from him, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "There are stories that predate the park," he said softly. "Before settlers, before logging camps, before the trails. Stories told by the tribes that lived here long before any of us." I felt the hair on my arms rise. "What kind of stories?" He exhaled slowly, as though the words themselves might draw something closer. "Stories about something that lives beneath the pines, beneath the soil, beneath the caves that look like caves but aren't. They said the forest had a keeper, an old thing, older than language. Some called it a guardian. Others," he hesitated, "others called it a collector." My skin prickled. "A collector of what?" Matson's eyes lifted to mine, and for a moment the station lights flickered, humming in the ceiling as if reacting to his silence. "Of those who don't listen," he said at last. A chill crawled down my spine. "The missing hikers?" I whispered. He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He didn't have to. The stories I'd heard from locals, the strange disappearances, the strange cases that had never made sense, all of it suddenly rearranged itself in my mind like stones falling into place. "And the knocks?" I asked. 3 slow knocks?" Matson's jaw tightened. "The first knock is curiosity. The second is acknowledgement. The third," his voice dropped, "the third is invitation." I shook my head slowly. "It knocked at the fire cabin. It knocked because it knew you were there, because you went near the cave." My pulse thudded hard enough to blur the edges of my vision. "I didn't enter the cave," I said. "I stayed at the entrance. You don't have to go inside," Matson replied. "You only have to be noticed. Outside the window," the pines stood motionless, tall and black against the pale morning glow. But something inside me knew they weren't still. Not truly. They were listening. They always were. "What do I do now?" I asked, voice thinner than I intended. Matson didn't answer immediately. He seemed to weigh the question carefully, his gaze drifting back to the trees. Finally, he said, "You walk." "Walk? Walk the forest," he said, "as if you're a guest, not its keeper. You acknowledge it. You let it see you without fear. You let it know you understand your place. And if I don't, you won't sleep," he said plainly. "You won't rest. Every whisper, every shift in the branches, every breath between the trees will feel like it's meant for you. And eventually, it will be." My mouth went dry. "So you're saying this thing can be reasoned with?" Matson shook his head. "Not reasoned with, respected." Something about that word felt too small for the force that had pressed its breath through the walls of the cabin. "But if it wanted to hurt me," I murmured, "why didn't it?" Matson's expression turned grave. "It doesn't want to hurt you," he said. "Not yet. It wants you to understand." "To understand what?" What he said next felt like the final snap of a branch in an already splintering world, that the forest remembers everyone who walks into its shadows, and some shadows want to leave with you. A cold tremor ran through my entire body. I stood abruptly. I need air. Matson didn't try to stop me. He didn't even stand. He just watched with eyes that looked older than mine, older than his, older than the forest itself. Eyes of someone who had seen something once and never let himself see it again. I stepped outside into the early morning light. Frost crackled under my boots. Breath rose in thin plumes. The sky above the pines glowed faintly with the first hints of sunrise. I walked to the edge of the tree line and stopped, staring into the dense, dark interior of the woods. The silence stretched out, deep and patient. "I know you're there," I whispered. A breeze pushed through the branches, gentle, almost curious. "I'm not here to fight you," I said, voice barely audible. "I've never been here to fight you." The wind stopped. The branches stilled. The silence deepened. And in that silence, the pines shifted, not physically, but perceptibly, as if their attention tightened, as if something beneath the soil leaned upward, listening. "I've seen you," I said. "I've felt you, and I'm not pretending anymore. I'm part of this forest, whether I understand it or not." The air warmed, subtly, briefly, like the forest exhaled in acknowledgement. Then, deeper within the pines, a slow knock sounded. 1. Then after several seconds, 2. My breath caught. The third knock never came. Instead, the wind stirred again, this time softly, brushing past me, drifting through my jacket like a quiet hand placed against my spine. Not pushing, not pulling, just present. The forest wasn't testing me anymore. It was accepting me, or at least allowing me to stay. For now. As the sun rose higher, washing the treetops in gold, I felt something shift inside me. A new awareness, a new burden. A new belonging that didn't feel entirely safe but felt undeniably real. These woods had chosen me, not as a victim, not as prey, but as a witness, a keeper of stories the locals still whisper, a protector and a participant in something ancient that breathes beneath the roots and caves and shadows of the borrowed pines. And as long as I walk these trails, I will carry the truth with me. Not every spirit in the forest wants to harm you, but none of them want to be forgotten. The night the pines first spoke to me, I remember the wind wasn't moving at all. The entire forest felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to step deeper into it. I'd walked those ranger trails for years, through snowmelt and wildfire haze, through black bear seasons and storms that split old-growth trunks, but nothing had ever felt like that silent, like something unseen had commanded the whole woods to listen. My name is Cal. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've served as a forest ranger in the northern reaches of the Rockies. The locals here don't tell stories, they whisper them. And they never whisper unless what they're saying comes from something they've felt in their bones. If you stay long enough, you begin to understand why. This land remembers everything. Every footstep, every voice, every mistake. I started my service with the kind of confidence you only get in your 20s, when your knees are strong, your hearing sharp, and your sense of invincibility louder than your common sense. I believed that the woods were a place you could master with enough training, that every outcome had a logical explanation. I trusted the manuals, the procedures, the maps. I trusted my own reasoning most of all. That confidence didn't last long. You can't guard a forest like this. You can only survive it. I work out of a small outpost perched near the tree line, where the lodgepole pines give way to cliffs and caves carved by time and storms. My territory stretches for miles, ridges scarred by lightning, shadowed valleys thick with brush, canyons where sound travels too far and too strangely. If you shout your own name, sometimes you hear it echoed back by something that doesn't sound entirely like you. The first time that happened, one of the old-timers smiled and said the forest likes to test new blood. He wasn't joking. Around here, you never assume a strange sound is just the wind. In my first year, the locals taught me more than any academy ever did. They taught me how to walk with my head low when the fog thickens, because the fog has a way of turning familiar paths into places you swear you've never seen before. They taught me that sometimes the pines moan like they're grieving, especially after the first snow. And most important, they taught me to trust the feeling in my gut when something in the woods shifts, when the air goes still, when the birds fall quiet, when the scent of sap suddenly sharpens like fresh cut wood, even though nothing has fallen. People disappear out here. That's not a ghost story. That's fact. And when someone vanishes in the woods, the line between explanation and the impossible gets blurred fast. I didn't always believe what I'm about to tell you. I resisted it for years. Denial is easy when the daylight is strong and the trails are clear. But when the sun drops and your flashlight beam catches eyes that blink from too high in the trees, or when you hear footsteps in snow that hasn't been touched yet, denial starts sounding like a luxury. There's a reason the locals whisper. The first strange situation I ever encountered happened during a late autumn patrol. Nights come early here, and the darkness is heavier than any I've seen in the lower states, so thick it feels like it has weight, like you're walking through something alive. I'd been sent to check a remote campsite where 2 hunters claimed something had circled their tent 3 nights in a row. They said it walked like a man, but didn't sound like one. And when they fired warning shots, whatever it was didn't flinch. I expected a bear, maybe an elk. Maybe the exaggerated tale of 2 guys who'd had too much whiskey. Instead, I found prints, deep ones, wide ones, spaced like something long and heavy had walked on 2 legs. They were half melted by the day's weak sunlight, but the shape was unmistakable. Too long for a man, too narrow for a bear, with toes that splayed in angles I'd never seen on any legitimate animal. I knelt in the dirt and touched the indentation. It was warm. That was the first moment in my career when I hesitated to call anything impossible. The hunters had already packed up and left by the time I got there. They left behind a torn tarp, a shredded cooler, and a single torn boot print leading toward the river, as if only one of them had run. I followed the track to the water's edge where the river ran black, thick with the reflection of the pines leaning overhead. The air had a strange scent, earthy but sour, like wet animal fur mixed with crushed fern. The longer I smelled it, the more wrong it felt, like something familiar had been warped. I radioed in what I found. My supervisor told me to log it and head back, but something in my chest pulled me deeper along the riverbank, as if curiosity had taken the reins from common sense. I moved slowly, listening. Every twig snap felt louder, every breath felt colder, and then ahead of me I heard it. A low exhale. Not a growl, not a snort, a breath. Slow, measured, human. Except not. I raised my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the brush. Nothing. The breathing stopped. And then, from behind me, closer than anyone had a right to be without making a sound, I heard my own name whispered back to me in a voice that wasn't mine. Cal, just one word. A mimicry so precise it made my scalp tighten. I spun so fast the beam fractured across the trees. Nothing moved. But the forest felt awake then, fully, intensely awake. Like hundreds of unseen eyes were watching from between the trunks. That was the first time I felt real fear in the woods. Not the instinctive fear of predators. Not the rational fear of being alone in the dark. This was a deeper kind of fear. The kind that bypasses logic entirely and speaks directly to the oldest part of your brain, the part that still remembers we were prey long before we ever held tools. I stood there for a long moment, listening to my heartbeat pound in my ears. I kept telling myself I'd imagined it. Stress, a trick of acoustics, some hunter messing with me from the trees. My mind scrambled for reason the way a drowning man scrabbles for a rope. But the woods didn't give me any reason. Just that heavy silence again, pressing in from all sides. Eventually, I turned back toward the trail, but every step felt like a negotiation with the darkness. My instincts screamed at me not to turn around, because something would be there. If I did. Something tall, something pale, something that understood my name well enough to say it back. I kept walking until the scent faded and the trees loosened around me. When I finally made it back to my truck, the engine roared to life like a lifeline, and I drove with the kind of urgency I didn't want to admit to anyone. I told myself I'd imagined it. I told myself I'd been tired. But deep down, the seed of doubt had been planted, small and persistent. And once doubt roots itself in a ranger's mind, it grows like ivy, wrapping around every assumption you once relied on. That was only the beginning. In the weeks after that night by the river, I did what most rangers do when they experience something they can't rationalize. I buried it under routine, paperwork, trail inspections, visitor reports, anything to keep my mind anchored to the version of reality I still wanted to believe in. But the forest has a way of reminding you that it doesn't care what you believe. It cares what you feel. And I was feeling watched. It started small, a faint clicking sound following me during dusk patrols, the sense of movement behind me that always stopped when I turned, an occasional sour scent drifting on the wind, stirring up old unease. At first, I blamed the season. Autumn in the Rockies can twist even a familiar path into something uncanny. Shifting shadows, temperature dropping fast, animals prepping for winter. The woods become hungrier, more alert. That's what I told myself. But then the locals started talking again. An older man who lived near the base of the ridge came into our outpost one morning, face pale, hat clutched tight in both hands. He said he'd heard something pacing outside his cabin at night, something that breathed like it had lungs too large for any normal creature. He'd lived there 40 years. He wasn't the type to scare easily. But as he spoke, the way he kept glancing at the door made the hair on my arms rise. I filed his report. I didn't tell him it matched what I'd heard by the river. Over the next month, 3 different hikers reported what they called tall silhouettes in the trees, watching but never approaching. One pair claimed a shape had followed them for 2 miles without making a sound. Another said they heard the sound of something large knocking on wood, rhythmically, almost like communication. But whenever they tried to pinpoint the source, the knocking jumped locations, as if the forest itself was mocking them. I should have taken those stories more seriously. Instead, I wrote them off as unrelated events, the kind of wilderness jitters inexperienced hikers often get. I told myself I needed to stay grounded, not lean into superstition. But underneath that reasoning was something else, something I hated admitting, fear of confirming what I already suspected. It was easier to deny than to accept I had actually heard something say my name. The breaking point came during a midwinter rescue call. A solo backpacker had gone missing in one of the higher valleys, an area notorious for sudden whiteouts and aggressive wind tunnels. When our radio crackled with the alert, I grabbed my pack and started toward the trailhead before my supervisor even finished the assignment. Search and rescue wasn't just part of the job, it was personal. Every lost hiker felt like a reminder of how thin the line was between wilderness and tragedy. By the time I reached the valley, the storm had already started its descent. Snow swirled sideways, stinging my face and biting through my gloves. The sky was a flat sheet of gray, the kind that feels like it's pressing down on the mountains. Tracks were easy to lose in conditions like that. And yet, I found them. Faint at first, then clearer, then erratic. The hiker had started steady, but something had spooked him. I saw it in the stride. The widening spacing, the heavier indent on the toes. He'd been running. But running from what? I followed the trail until it vanished near a cluster of boulders, where the snow fell in uneven drifts. I scanned the area with my flashlight, yelling the hiker's name until my throat burned. No answer, only the wind. I pressed deeper between the rocks where the snow was strangely undisturbed, like something had sheltered the ground from above. Then I smelled it, that same sour earth scent from the riverbank. Wet fur, crushed fern, only stronger now. Too strong. The kind of smell that clings to your clothes long after you've left. I steadied myself. Wind can carry scents. So can wildlife. I told myself this on loop. But my hands still tightened around my flashlight. That's when I saw the cave. It wasn't marked on our maps, at least not the official ones. A narrow opening between the rocks, tall enough for a person to walk through but too deep to see the end. Snow clung to the entrance in uneven patches, like it had been brushed aside by something large. The air around it felt wrong, warmer than the rest of the valley, dense with moisture, and there in the slush right before the entrance was a single boot print, the missing hikers. I crouched down studying the print. It was fresh, hours old at most, which meant the hiker could still be inside, alive, in danger, or not alone. I radioed my location, but the storm disrupted the signal. Static, then silence. I tried again. Nothing. SOP said to wait for clearer reception before entering any unverified cave. But standard operating procedures mean nothing when someone might be dying 50 feet ahead of you. So I stepped inside. The first 5 feet were harmless, just dripping stone and the echo of water droplets hitting rock. But the deeper I went, the more the air changed, warmer, wetter, thicker, and the smell intensified until I could taste it, metallic and earthy at once. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, shaking only slightly in my hand. Then I heard it, breathing, slow, heavy. Not mine. I froze. The breathing echoed against the walls, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. It could have been 5 feet away or 30. I raised my flashlight, sweeping the beam along the cave walls. That was when I saw the scratches, not claw marks, not the scraping of tools. These were long, deliberate etchings, parallel lines carved again and again into the stone until they formed deep grooves. Some were at shoulder height, others far above my head. Whatever made them had strength and reach, and patience. I whispered the hiker's name. The cave swallowed it instantly. The breathing stopped. What followed was worse than any sound. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. A silence so complete it felt intentional, like something was listening for me to move. My body locked. I kept the beam steady, though my hand trembled. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run, to never look back. But there was still a chance the hiker was alive, and I couldn't walk away. So I stepped deeper. My boot accidentally kicked a loose stone. The echo cracked like a rifle shot. And from the darkness ahead, something answered with a low, resonant sound, half inhale, half growl. Not human, not remotely human. I backed up slowly, trying not to make noise, but fear makes you clumsy. My pack scraped the rock wall and the sound echoed. The response came instantly, heavy footfalls, deliberate, approaching. I didn't think, I ran. Caves distort sound, swallow direction, twist distance. As I sprinted toward the entrance, the footsteps behind me grew louder, closer, impossibly fast. The cave walls blurred as the flashlight beam shook wildly. My breath tore out of me in ragged gasps. I didn't dare look back. Then a shape moved in the corner of my vision. Tall, pale against the dark. Taller than any man. Shoulders brushing the cave ceiling. Eyes reflecting my light with a dull animal sheen. I stumbled into daylight just as a massive crash sounded behind me. Rock splitting, stone raining down. I spun around, expecting something to burst out after me. Nothing did. The cave entrance had partially collapsed, new fractures running along the rock face, as if something enormous had slammed into it with brute force. The storm swallowed the silence again, and I realized I couldn't hear the breathing anymore. I never found the hiker, but the footprints leading toward the cave, they never led away. I didn't tell the department everything about that day. I left out the breathing, the size of the silhouette, the way the stone looked like it had been struck by something with the force of a battering ram. I reported the collapse, the conditions, the inability to locate the missing hiker. I recommended a formal closure of the area until geological inspection could be completed. They agreed. It was winter, after all. Slippery rock faces and sudden storms were reason enough. But I knew better. Something had driven that man into the cave. Something had kept him there. And something had come within feet of me before the rock shifted and sealed us apart. For weeks afterward, I kept dreaming about that moment, the echo of footsteps behind me, the warm, wet breath in the cave, the way the darkness felt aware. In the dreams, I always turned around, and in the dreams, the eyes staring back at me weren't quite human. I tried to reason it out. Stress, auditory distortion, the mind stitching shadows into shapes. But denial wasn't as easy as it used to be. Not when the forest itself seemed to change around me. Because after the cave, everything escalated. The locals stopped walking alone at night, even the ones who claimed to be mountain tough. Fireside whispers returned. Stories older than the logging trails, passed from grandparents who barely trusted their own memories of what they'd seen. Stories of tall figures in the trees, of deep voices that mimicked human speech, of scratches carved into stone long before settlers arrived, of watchers. Stories that had always sounded like folklore, until they didn't. But the worst came from a woman named Mara, who lived 3 miles down the service road. She found me one morning sitting in my truck outside her cabin, finishing up a patrol report. She knocked on the door, startling me out of my exhaustion-induced trance. When I rolled down my window, she leaned in close, her voice trembling. "You need to tell your people to stop looking for it." Those were her first words. Not good morning. Not a greeting. Just that. I stepped out to talk to her properly, trying to calm her, but she was already scanning the tree line like something might step out at any moment. She told me about nights when she heard slow, heavy footsteps circling her house, not passing by, but circling, pausing at each window, breathing against the glass. She said the voice that whispered outside wasn't speaking English. Not fully, but it was trying too hard. She looked at me then, eyes red from lack of sleep, voice breaking. It's learning us. Her words hit me harder than I expected. Because deep down, I'd felt the same thing, but hadn't dared articulate it. Whatever I'd heard in that cave, whatever had said my name earlier that season, it hadn't been copying noises randomly. It had been studying, mimicking, practicing. I filed her report. I advised her to stay with a relative until we did another sweep of the area. But she refused to leave. Said the land was her family's, that she wouldn't be chased from it by something that didn't belong here. Before she went inside, she said one last thing. "If you hear your name again, don't answer." I didn't know how she guessed that detail, but it rattled me so deeply that I didn't sleep that night. In the following days, more incidents surfaced. A pair of trappers found a clearing full of shredded elk hides, but no bones, no tracks, no blood trail leading in or out. Pace, a wildlife photographer, reported that the forest went completely silent one afternoon. Every bird, every squirrel, every insect sound, gone all at once, like a switch had been flipped. A couple camping near the ridge claimed that something tall walked past their tent after midnight and left a handprint on the fabric. The handprint was enormous. None of these events were unprecedented on their own. Predators can drag prey. Temperature shifts can freeze sound. Bears can stand upright. But I'd been in these woods long enough to know when something didn't fit. And none of this fit. Still, I clung to whatever rational explanations I could find, because accepting the alternative meant accepting that something ancient was roaming these mountains, and that it noticed me. Then came the night I nearly died. It was early spring. Snowmelt season. The rivers were swollen, the ground soft, the trails still slick with patches of black ice. My supervisor asked me to check a small fire tower at the edge of our jurisdiction, an old structure still used during lightning season. The last crew had reported strange noises from below the tower, like someone knocking on the supports. They'd chalked it up to thermal shifts in the wood. But given the other reports that had been stacking up, the request felt loaded. I set out alone. Bad decision. I knew better. But the trail was short, and the daylight seemed strong enough. I hiked fast, trying to beat the sunset. The tower stood above the pines like a wooden skeleton, its metal braces groaning in the wind. As I climbed the steps, I felt the structure shudder beneath me, not violently, but like something had brushed it from below. I paused, listening. Cold air swept between the beams, carrying a scent I recognized instantly, that sour, earthy smell. The smell from the river. The cave. Mara's property. I gripped the railing, frozen. Part of me wanted to retreat back down the stairs, get into my truck, and pretend I'd never come here. But another part, The ranger part knew that if something was stalking this tower, turning back would only make me a target. So I forced myself upward. At the top, the cabin creaked as I opened the door. Dust coated the console. The radio was off. The windows were fogged from the difference in temperature. But on the far wall near the vent, the frost patterns were wrong. Long, jagged streaks, almost like drag marks, like something with sharp nails had scraped the condensation away. My pulse hammered. The tower groaned again. This time it wasn't wind, it was footsteps, slow, heavy, moving beneath the structure. I crouched, trying to breathe quietly. The sound came again, wood bending under weight. I looked through the floor slats. At first, I saw nothing, just patterns of pine needles and drifting snow shadows far below. Then something stepped into view. A foot, pale, broad, long toes splayed unnaturally wide. Not human, not animal, something in between. It paused directly under the tower and tilted its head back. Through the slats, I saw an eye, just one, black, glossy, reflecting the dim cabin light like a shard of obsidian. I froze. My heartbeat was so loud I was sure it could hear it. The creature inhaled, slow, deep, deliberate. Then it spoke. Not a sentence, not a word, just a single sound, low and distorted, like it was dragging the syllable across a throat not made to shape human speech. Cal, my name, again, but clearer this time, more confident, like it had learned the right shape of the vowels. I don't remember dropping my flashlight, but I remember the sound it made. It slipped from my hand, bounced once off the floorboards, then clattered through the slats and fell into the pines below. The moment it hit the ground, the creature moved. Fast. Fast. So fast the tower shook violently, like swaying under its charge. I could feel it slamming against the supports, trying to knock the structure over. Each impact rattled my bones. The metal braces screamed. I stumbled back from the window, bracing myself against the opposite wall as the entire tower lurched. Then, suddenly, silence. No breathing. No movement. No voice. Just wind. But I didn't trust it. Not for a second. I waited long minutes before descending, each step feeling like an invitation to be grabbed from below. When I reached the ground, the forest looked normal again, except the footprints. Huge, deep, leading away toward the ridge, and beside them, barely visible in the snow, were claw marks, 4 parallel lines, just like the ones in the cave. I tried to convince myself to take a few days off. I even filled out the paperwork and left it on my supervisor's desk. But that night, lying in my cabin with the stove fire dying low, something settled on me heavier than the fear. Shame. Rangers are trained to confront danger, not run from it. And as much as I wanted to pretend otherwise, part of me needed answers, not just for the missing hiker or Mara or the old man at the base of the ridge, but for myself. I needed to know that I wasn't losing my grip on reality. So at dawn, I tore the leaf slip in half and headed back out onto the trails. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not because I wanted to be reckless, but because I didn't want to explain why. How do you tell another ranger you're tracking something that talks like a person, but moves like a nightmare? Something that walks on 2 legs, leaves monstrous prints, and knows your name? You don't. You go alone, because if you're wrong, you look unstable. And if you're right, you don't want anyone else out there with you. For days, I followed carved trees, shredded bark, abandoned dens, strange patterns in the snow. I listened for the breathing I hoped I'd never hear again. Every night I dreamed of the cave, its dark throat-swallowing sound, its long scratches on the stone. I started waking up with the feeling that someone had been watching me sleep, standing just outside the edges of my dream. The locals kept whispering. More sightings, more sounds. Someone claimed their livestock had been taken without a drop of blood left behind. Another swore they saw a tall figure crouched on a boulder, unmoving, almost statuesque, until it dropped silently out of sight. But the story that finally broke through my mental defenses came from a young couple who stopped me on the main road near dusk. They were pale, shivering, clutching each other like children. The woman spoke first. Barely. It followed us. I asked what she meant, and she shook her head as though even trying to remember was painful. We thought it was a man, she said. It was standing in the river, just standing there. But the water only reached halfway up its shins, and the river was deep. Her boyfriend added that they tried calling out to it before realizing something was wrong. The figure didn't turn, didn't shift, didn't react. So they walked faster, then ran, then scrambled up the ridge until they couldn't breathe. And that's when they heard the footsteps. Fast, heavy, keeping pace even as they sprinted. It didn't chase them, it just stayed behind them at the same distance. Close enough for them to hear its breathing. Close enough for them to know it wanted them to hear it. I asked if they saw its face. They both shook their heads. It didn't have one, the woman whispered. Not that they could see. That was the moment I accepted something I'd fought against for months. The rational explanations were dead. They weren't even in the room anymore. Whatever was stalking these woods wasn't a bear, wasn't a man, and wasn't something we had a name for. And it wasn't just wandering. It was watching. It was learning. It was choosing. After that, everything in me shifted from denial to something fiercer and more dangerous. Determination. If this thing was using my forest like its hunting grounds, I needed to understand how, and I needed to find where it stayed when the sun rose. Because creatures like this don't vanish, they hide. I remembered the cave, the way the air felt warmer inside it, the strange marks high on the walls. The smashed entrance after whatever I had encountered tried to break free. I started tracing geological maps and old trail books, digging through records from decades before my time. Most caves in our region were documented, except for the unofficial ones, the ones too unstable to list or too remote to matter, or too old. I visited a retired ranger, someone who'd served before the area became a national forest. He was in his 80s and nearly blind, but his memory was frighteningly sharp. When I mentioned the valley where the cave had been, his face went pale. "You found that place?" he asked. He told me that long before modern trail systems were built, native families avoided that specific ridge, not out of superstition, but out of observation. Hunters disappeared there. Elk vanished without trace. People heard voices calling them from the trees, voices that sounded like friends or relatives who weren't actually present. He called it the deep echo. I asked what that meant, and he shook his head slowly. Not an echo like sound, an echo of intention. Something in that land listens, and it remembers the shape of you. That phrase struck me like lightning, remembers the shape of you. The creature in the tower, the voice near the river, the breathing in the cave, the footsteps behind the hikers, the handprint on the tent, the woman saying it was learning us. It wasn't random. It wasn't acting on instinct. It was studying. It was evolving, and it had noticed me more than once. I left the old ranger's cabin with my stomach in knots. The sun was setting, streaking the snow with long shadows. As I hiked back toward my truck, every tree felt like an eye. Every gust of wind felt like a breath. The forest wasn't just watching me anymore. It was anticipating me. The next night sealed everything. It was past midnight, and I had just finished a patrol sweep near the high ridge. I was exhausted, dragging my boots through snow that had grown thick and uneven. Clouds had swallowed the moon. The air tasted of metal and pine sap. I kept telling myself I'd return to the outpost soon and get a few hours of sleep. Then something crackled in my radio. At first it sounded like static, then like wind, then like breathing, heavy, familiar breathing. I stopped walking. The radio hissed again, then carried a voice that froze every muscle in my body. Cal. Not shouted, not whispered, just spoken gently like someone saying my name from across a quiet room, except the voice wasn't mine and it wasn't quite human. My instinct told me to turn off the radio, but something deeper, panic, made my hands slip. The radio clattered to the ground. In that moment, everything around me fell deadly silent. The trees, the wind, my own heartbeat. Then I heard footsteps behind me, slow, heavy, crunching the snow in perfect rhythm. I felt the air change, a subtle shift, as if something immense had stepped into my periphery. I didn't turn, couldn't. My legs locked. My breath came in shallow, ragged pulls. The thing behind me inhaled, long and deep. Then it said my name again, closer this time. Cal. Ice shot through my spine. Every instinct, every shred of training, every survival reflex screamed at me to run. But another part of me, the part that had been unraveling for months, still held on to denial like a lifeline. Maybe it was a trick of sound. Maybe the radio had malfunctioned. Maybe the breathing grew louder, warmer, closer, and then something touched my shoulder, lightly, almost curious. I broke. I ran so hard the world blurred. Branches slashed my face. My boots slipped on ice. My lungs burned. The footsteps thundered behind me, too fast, too heavy, gaining ground. I could feel its presence, the weight of it, the intention of it, like a shadow stretching far beyond anything natural. I didn't look back. I think that's the only reason I'm still alive. When I finally reached the outpost, slamming the door behind me, I collapsed on the floor. My entire body shook. My clothes stank of that sour scent. My shoulder felt cold where it had touched me, like the cold had burrowed into the muscle. It didn't follow me inside. Whatever rules bind that thing, the walls meant something to it. But it had come closer than ever. Too close. And for the first time in my career, I felt truly hunted. I didn't sleep at all after that night. Not because I didn't try. Exhaustion hollowed me out. But because every time I closed my eyes, I felt that touch again. Light, curious, almost gentle, like the way a predator might test the softness of something before deciding whether or not to bite. By dawn, I'd made a decision I never thought I'd make. I wasn't going to run, and I wasn't going to pretend anymore. If the creature had marked me, if it had chosen me, then the only way to survive was to understand why. Not as a ranger, not as a skeptic, but as someone who'd stepped too close to the truth and could no longer look away. And somewhere inside this forest, deep where the pines grow older than memory, the truth was waiting. I geared up before sunrise. No gun. What good would a bullet do against something that moved like sound and hit like a falling tree? I brought a flare, a compass, extra batteries, water, and a knife I knew was mostly symbolic. But it steadied me, reminded me of the version of myself who once trusted rules and steel and daylight. Before I left, I pinned a note to the outpost wall. Not a confession, just a location and a direction. If someone had to come looking for me, they'd know where the trail started, even if they never found where it ended. The air was brittle cold outside, the kind that seems to ring with quiet. Frost coated the grass. My breath coiled in front of me like smoke from an old chimney. The forest ahead looked normal, quiet, still, peaceful. But I'd learned by then that normal is just the mask the woods wears when it wants you to let your guard down. I walked for hours, following the old ridgeline toward the collapsed cave. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt. Thicker, almost humid, even in the dead of cold. Animals avoided the area. No tracks, no scat, no birdsong, not even the nervous chatter of squirrels. The silence was too complete, too intentional. 100 yards from the cave, I found new footprints. Not mine, not the hikers. The same elongated, wide-footed impressions I'd seen in the snow weeks earlier, pressed deep into the softened soil. But now there were more of them. Dozens circling the area, pacing along the rocks, weaving between trees in strange spirals, as though something had been waiting, planning, watching. The cave entrance was still half collapsed, the rocks scattered like shattered bones. But the air that seeped out from between the cracks was warm, moist, breathing, just like before. I crouched, pressing my hand near the stone. Heat radiated out, not from sunlight, not from friction, but from something alive deeper inside. Something enormous. I was ready to turn back. I won't lie, not because of fear, though fear had rooted deep into every part of me by then, but because stepping into that place again felt like stepping into the mind of something that didn't think like us, didn't feel like us, didn't understand boundaries or mercy or meaning the way humans do. But then I heard something that froze me. Not breathing, not footsteps, crying, faint, high, shaking, a human cry. My heart jammed in my throat. It was the missing hiker. I was sure of it. The sound echoed through the rocks like someone calling for help from beneath the earth. Thin, weak, desperate. That was all it took. I wedged my shoulder against the loosened stone, shoving until it shifted enough for me to squeeze inside. The air hit me immediately, thick, almost wet, like stepping into an animal's lair. My flashlight flickered as I pushed deeper, the beam cutting through the damp darkness. The crying stopped. Instantly. The silence that followed felt wrong, not empty, but full. Listening, expectant, I whispered the hiker's name. No answer, but something answered the echo of my voice. A second voice. My voice. Repeating the exact same whisper, but lower as though it came from somewhere deeper in the cave. My blood ran cold. It wasn't the hiker. It was the creature, mimicking, calling me to come closer. For a moment I couldn't move. Not forward, not back. The darkness pressed around me like a living thing. My flashlight flickered again. When it steadied, the beam illuminated the walls. New scratches. Fresh scratches. Long, deliberate lines carved into the stone since the last time I stood here. Some at shoulder height. Some far above. Some etched low near the ground like claws dragging lazily through damp earth. I knew then that the cave wasn't just a shelter. It was a memory, a history, a map. Each scratch marking a presence that had lived here long before any ranger tower or dirt road existed, a lineage of watchers, a lineage of hunters. My breath echoed too loudly in the stone chamber. As I stepped deeper, the air temperature rose, unnaturally fast. A bead of sweat rolled down my spine despite the cold outside. The beam of my flashlight bounced across the floor and stopped on something pale. Bone. Dozens of bones. Not arranged randomly. Arranged purposefully, like offerings. Some were animal, elk, deer, maybe a mountain lion, but some were long, thin, unmistakably human. The missing hiker hadn't walked out of this place. No one had. A crack sounded behind me, a footstep, slow, deliberate. My breath stopped. I didn't turn. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body screamed that turning around would end everything. That if I looked at it fully, if I met its eyes in the dark, whatever thin thread of humanity still existed between us would snap. It stepped closer. The breath behind me was warm, damp, heavy. I felt its presence, not like a person, but like a mountain leaning in, like the weight of something older than language pressing into the tight space. It inhaled deeply, as though smelling my fear. Then, in the darkness behind me, it spoke again, Cal. But this time, the voice wasn't distorted. It wasn't struggling. It wasn't mimicking. It sounded exactly like me. Perfectly. My throat tightened so hard I couldn't breathe. I forced myself not to turn, not to run, not to move. I felt the creature's breath shift closer to my neck, warm enough that condensation formed on my skin. Then it said something new, something in my voice, but shaped with its own intention. Don't leave. My blood iced over. The creature stepped closer. I felt the cave tighten around us, the air vibrating with something predatory, something patient. That's when I remembered Mara's words. If you hear your name again, don't answer. I didn't answer. I did the only thing I could. I pulled the flare from my pack, struck it hard against the stone floor, and threw it behind me. The cave erupted in red light, and in that split second, less than a heartbeat, I saw it. Tall. Twisted. Pale like a thing grown in darkness, shoulders scraping the stone, arms too long, a head that tilted with unnatural curiosity, and eyes, black and reflective, the way obsidian swallows flame. Its face wasn't human, but it was trying to be. It recoiled at the flare's brightness with a guttural sound that ripped through the cave, shaking loose dust and pebbles. I ran, stumbling, slipping, tearing my palms on the rock. The creature's footsteps thundered behind me, shaking the ground, slamming into the narrowing walls. I reached the entrance just as the flare sputtered out. The creature lunged. The cave mouth collapsed. A roar of stone, a burst of dust, a shockwave of earth. And then silence. Absolute silence. I crawled out into the cold daylight, bleeding, shaking, half blind. When I turned back, the cave entrance was sealed under tons of rock. The creature was trapped or hibernating or waiting. I don't know. I don't think I want to know. The forest hasn't been the same since. The silence lingers longer. The pines lean in closer. The locals still whisper, maybe louder now. Some say they hear knocking in the ground at night. Others swear the wind is carrying a new voice through the valleys. Mine. As for me, I'm still here, still walking these trails, still listening, because the truth is simple and terrifying. Some spirits of the pines are not ghosts. Some are not myths. Some are not stories. Some are flesh. Some are watching, some remember the shape of you, and some never stop learning your name.